You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the fate of looted antiquities in Syria. With me is Malu Halasa, an editor and writer in London, Richard Clay, a senior lecturer in the history of art at the University of Birmingham, Dr. Halla Diyab, a Syrian writer and filmmaker, and Emma Cunliffe from the UK Committee of the Blue Shield. They are the forgotten victims of the Syrian conflict, while the world's attention quite rightly focuses on the deaths of civilians in Syria. Amid this destruction of life is the destruction of something which is also precious, namely culture. The lines are becoming ever more blurred between those who are fighting Bashar al-Assad's forces. They do include insurgents, but they also include Islamic fundamentalists who have started to destroy Syria's greatest treasures. These include archaeological treasures such as Byzantine mosaics and Greek and Roman statues. And the systematic destruction of antiquities is seen by some as possibly the worst disaster to ancient monuments since the Taliban in Afghanistan dynamited the giant statues of Buddha at Bamiyan back in 2001. Last month, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, that's ISIS, an al-Qaeda-type movement controlling much of northeast Syria, blew up and destroyed a 6th century Byzantine mosaic near the city of Raqqa. Other sites destroyed by fundamentalists include the reliefs carved at the Shash Hamdan, which is a Roman cemetery in Aleppo province. Also, in the Aleppo countryside, statues carved out of the sides of a valley at Al-Qatora have been deliberately targeted by gunfire. What is the significance of these losses? Clearly, an international response focuses on the loss of life. But what does the loss of a country's cultural life signify? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Richard Clay. He's a senior lecturer in history of art at the University of Birmingham, and he's an expert in iconoclasm. Also here in the studio is Malu Halasa, an editor and writer in London, and her upcoming book is called Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline. Also here in the studio, Dr. Halla Diyab, a Syrian writer and filmmaker. And on the line, Emma Cunliffe from the UK Committee of the Blue Shield. Warm welcome to you all. Malu Halasa, what are we seeing at the moment in Syria? I mean, what kind of treasures are there in the first place? Because perhaps people in the West don't actually know what the patrimony of Syria is.
I think that people should realize that Syria, well, Damascus and Aleppo are both considered the oldest inhabited cities in the world. So the archaeological treasures, the architectural treasures go back. They're ancient and ageless. And really, people don't realize that the conflict that's going on there has destroyed quite a lot. And that also there's been a lot of looting of these sites. Specific sites have been targeted also by various extremist groups, whatever their reasons are for doing that, or that they are, doing this because this is what happened in Afghanistan also by various Islamic groups. It remains to be seen, but it is a great loss that's going on in Syria at the moment.
Halla, does this mean that the artifacts that we're talking about that are being destroyed were well protected before the conflict in Syria?
I mean, in general, in Middle East and even in Syria, like if you're speaking about it like a decade ago, there was a lot of awareness among Arab or Syrians about the importance of culture and heritage, especially the culture of a museum or visitor centers or attractions. And also because of this kind of relationship between the citizen and the government of dependence and independence, like the citizen in Syria used to be more dependent on the government to give them protection, to give them electricity, to give them water, to give them, to protect their culture. So the Syrian citizens were not raised on the awareness that also it is the responsibility of the individual towards the heritage and the culture to protect this culture. When the conflict happened, this has the turmoil that's happening in Syria, especially with all this militia, armed forces, thugs, hijackers of the Syrian revolution, they actually targeted a lot of cultural sites, mainly because of, al-Qaeda groups or the fundamentalist Muslims who come from or who believe in Salafi, Wahhabi, Islamic ideology, who do not believe in statue, who are against portrayal of a human in statue or monuments or even archaeological sites. And we have seen that in Afghanistan. And Syria, before the revolution, is more like Sufi Muslims. The majority are Sufi. What happened now is not only about the revolution against the dictator, but also it's about Talibanization, or if I say to change Syria into it's a sectarian war. So the Salafi armed group also want to suppress this mosaic and diverse culture in Syria.
And certainly a mosaic of different strands of Islamic faith, I would imagine. Malu, why do you think that these works have actually managed to coexist for so many centuries? I mean, how did these coexist for so long? I mean, that all of a sudden they're now at risk and vulnerable.
These various sites and monuments and places existed for so long is because Syria is like the birthplace of civilization, and that various groups have always lived together quite peacefully. So we're talking about ancient Christian groups, ancient, Muslim groups, that they've always been there, and that they've always protected those sites, and they've coexisted, and they've appreciated the culture. In the Salafi view, I think, they think that Islam is quite separate. But really, if you look at the Sufi influences over Syria, but also what they call Shami Islam, is that it's a much more open type of moderate Islam where everyone's included. I mean, I've traveled quite a lot in Syria, and I was never looked upon or treated any differently. So I think that also those attitudes go towards cultural heritage too, is that cultural heritage is not something that belongs to one group or another group, it belongs to the people.
I think there is a kind of spatial dynamics happening in Syria in relation between the regime and between the main cities in Syria. Syrian regime also focused on main big cities, especially Hama, Aleppo, Damascus, and even Hama. There was a kind of bitterness between the population because of the massacre that happened in the 80s and all this ambiguity and mystery. And there was a kind of this mysterious dynamic between the people of Hama and between the regime. And also there was not a lot of focus on the northeast of Syria, like Raqqa or even Deir ez-Zor or Daraa. And I remember when I lived in Syria, like there were no easy transportation if you want to go from Damascus into this north city. And if you look at the dynamic of the spatial domination of the Islamic states or the Salafis or the extremists in Syria, they went to the northeast of Syria, especially in Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, where the regime has not actually try to help or try to focus on these cities before the revolution. And there were a lot of archaeological sites there which have not been kept or protected. Even al-Assad, when she built the first museum in Damascus, or the Children's Museum, she was more concentrating on these big cities, and there was not a lot of concentration on the remote cities in Syria.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the fate of looted artefacts in Syria with Malu Halasa, Richard Clay, Dr. Halla Diyab and Emma Cunliffe. Richard, I know you're an expert in iconoclasm. Do you see this as iconoclasm? Because our typical view of that is the destruction of crosses, of icons and of that kind of stuff. What we're talking about here is statues.
It's a super complicated term, and you're right to say that it's commonly used by some people to mean really only the destruction of religious objects. But actually it's got much, much wider usage nowadays. And when we talk about people attacking the opinion of the Prime Minister and say they're an iconoclast, it's actually an early modern term, so it's a 17th century term, but it comes from the ancient Greek and it just means image breaking. So is destroying a building an act of iconoclasm? Some people would just say no, and some historians won't write about breaking buildings because it isn't iconoclasm. I'm comfortable to say all of the kinds of activities that we're talking about, which are symbolic breakings, are iconoclasm. It just makes sense to talk about them in relation to each other. But I am really struck, if you don't mind me stepping back to a question you asked a moment ago, by this observation of yours that this is a culture that is thousands of years old, and yet these objects haven't been destroyed or broken in the past. They've survived all of this time. Why the shift? And it seems to me, as I like many Westerners, become more familiar with Syria as a culture because of this awful disaster that it's living through. It's been brought to my attention that it's always been a diverse culture. But the big difference today is there's mass availability of weapons that can damage buildings, and that changed in the 20th century. That industrialises iconoclasm. There's also a mass media, and I think some of the iconoclasm that's being carried out by extreme Muslims is actually partly driven by their doctrine, but partly by an awareness of the fact that if you cut somebody's head off, you're not going to get on the news. But if you cut the head off a statue, you will. And that's a really interesting and really worrying shift.
Emma Cunliffe, do you see this this is as much about sending a message out to the rest of the world that that they don't consider what the West values as sacred?
It's a combination of factors. It's not even that simple, although that is certainly a part of it. For example, just a couple of days ago, one of the radical extremist groups placed a new video online threatening the citadel in the centre of Aleppo, which is part of the World Heritage Site, and parts of that citadel are about 5,000 years old. Now, the only reason to do that is partly, obviously, it might be a factor of religious beliefs, but it's not a particularly religiously symbolic site. There are far more religiously symbolic sites around it. That is just attention-seeking at the end of the day. There are also a lot of communities that are fundamentally involved in religious wars. So we've seen at Malu, for example, which is a tentative World Heritage Site, which has some of the oldest Christian sites in the world, and Aramaic is still spoken there, which is the language of Jesus. And it's not until we've seen this very strong increase in the number of extremists pouring into Syria that we start to see sites like that targeted. It actually stayed out of the conflict. And it's only really since about last September or so that we're now seeing that targeted very heavily. The churches are being destroyed, the nuns have been kidnapped, the items are for sale on the international market, not, I should add, legally. But it's also a time sequence. So as more extremists come into Syria, the rise in these attacks increase, which is a terrible thing to witness, but it's also incredibly hard to stop.
Halla, why are they destroying them then? You mentioned the Salafist strain. Is this because these images of are completely anathema to their faith?
What's happening in Syria is sectarian war, and they want the future Syria either to be like Shia Syria or Sunni Syria. And that's why the Salafi extremists, they try to dispose Syria from all mosaic variety, whether it is the minorities with the Christians representation in Syria, and even the Sufi representation, or even the Shia symbols in Syria. So it's about the future Syria to become one of the Salafi, like Afghanistan city, and dispose Syria of what was Syria about, the mosaic diversity of Syria.
Do some Muslims accept the beauty and treasure of these particular artifacts?
I thought you were going to ask me, do some Muslims in Syria, love the beauty of the mosaics? And I was thinking of the Umayyad Mosque. The Umayyad Mosque is one of the oldest mosques, and Muslims have been praying there for time immemorial. And within the setting, the mosque itself is quite ornate and quite beautiful. I think that Muslims would be very upset. This idea that somehow, yes, the Salafis definitely, they have a very stark view of Islam. But if you look at the representation and the art that's come out of Iran, and the history of visual culture in, for example, the Shia religion, there's a lot of representation. There is human form. They have a long tradition of murals. So, I mean, this idea that somehow across the board Islam doesn't like representation is wrong. I think that the people who are destroying these objects, these mosaics, these monuments in Syria definitely have a very narrow view of Islam. But I'm also wondering if it's not just that the destruction comes from a religious viewpoint. It obviously also comes from a viewpoint that these people are completely divorced from, what cultural heritage means.
Halla, you're saying that it's kind of a fight for supremacy amongst different strands of Islam. But given, as you've outlined, the Sufi tradition, is this the Salafis trying to settle some scores?
Of course, there was a lot of assassination of Sufi scholars inside Syria. And even if you look at the dynamics of the Middle East, there is always kind of conflict between the Sufi Islam and between the Salafi Islam, because Salafi Islam look at Sufi as bid'ah, it's something not Islamic, because Sufi is about singing, it's about self-development, it's about spirituality, it's about visiting monuments of people who have Islamic al-Bayt who come from the Prophet Muhammad. The Salafi doesn't want that. That's why they attack a lot of places near, or they try to attack a lot of places near Zainab, who is the daughter or from Ahl al-Bayt monument in Syria. And that is the conflict. However, having said that, there are some people who are destroying these places in Syria because they are just thugs. They're traffickers, they're thieves, they just want to destroy these places and get money. These fractions on the ground of Syria make it very difficult to understand the future vision that is going to happen in Syria.
Richard, teasing out those two strands there, the thuggish element, the kind of opportunistic looting, and the iconoclasm. Do these kinds of iconoclasts value the art that they're destroying?
I think they value it because they intend to sell it. It's just how do we measure value? So for you and I would hope, we would be interested in these objects because they're aesthetically attractive and valuable and historically valuable. But for these people, they're privileging overall other value at the fact that they can exchange these goods in a global art market. I can understand where you're coming from when you say that thugs are traffickers, they're thieves. They are thieves, but they're also extremely well organised, and they're selling this art. So there's a whole network of blame here. If we're going to point the finger at these people, we have to ask who's buying this stuff. From the reports I've been reading, it's actually often being stolen but to order, effectively. And you've got thefts going on not just from religious sites but from museums too. And then you've also got unlicensed archaeology taking place where the thieves are discovering new things by digging recklessly in historically very significant sites. So do they value the objects? Yes, they do.
Emma Cunliffe, the European Union has given UNESCO something like $3.5 million to establish a team to gather better information on what's happening in Syria and to fight the trafficking of artefacts. Do you think it's easier to combat the actual trade of these artefacts than to actually combat the looting of the artefacts themselves? These are priceless works of art. Presumably you can tackle illegal trafficking.
You can, but it's extremely difficult, partly because when you say what's something worth, it's worth what someone is willing to pay for it, which is in a huge range of objects coming out. So in Iraq, for example, cylinder seals were being taken, which are about the size of your thumb and can sell for anything from £1,000 to £250,000. So if you think of how many of those would go through the market, catching them when they're so tiny is incredibly difficult. When you look at where you would actually have to focus your energy, we do need tighter laws. I would definitely agree that the international antiquities market is not as tightly regulated as it needs to be to deal with this trade, although it would actually have to be practically draconian to actually achieve something. But balanced against enforcing that in a country with very decreased security, where the looters can access sites quite easily. Some sites, up to 80% of them, have been destroyed now. And these are hugely significant sites, but we can't get to them to stop them. And it's not enough just to rescue these items once they've reached the international market and reclaim them, because once they've been ripped out of their context, you don't actually know what was taken, you don't know where it was from, and you can't even trace the information about that object. It just becomes an object of art. Whereas once it might have been part of the earliest library in the world, suddenly it just becomes a text. And so it's not enough just to actually save these items and then try and return them. Although a lot of the time you don't even know where they've come from to know which country to give them back to.
But you do mention Iraq there, and I'm just wondering, I mean, there was considerable looting of Iraq's ancient ruins that followed, I guess, well, some would say the indifference of Iraq's newly sovereign government. Do you think that's the same case in Syria? Because Syria, the Syrian government has told UNESCO that it's emptied the country's 34 museums and moved the contents to safer places. Clearly what's being stolen aren't in museums, but is there a commitment there, and have lessons been learnt from Iraq?
A lot of recommendations were made following Iraq. Not all of them were enforced, unfortunately. The illegal antiquities market follows many of the same paths as the illegal trade in drugs and arms, and there are very strong connections between the three of them. So antiquities are being traded for the same routes that guns are being smuggled in and out the country, which again makes it very, very hard to enforce.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the fate of looted artefacts in Syria with Malu Halasa, Richard Clay, Dr. Halla Diyab and Emma Cunliffe.
One of the reasons why these places are destroyed is to really strike terror into the heart of the civilians. I mean, for example, in Raqqa, ISIS took down a crucifix that was on a church, and in the middle of the night, nonviolent activists, young men, stole the crucifix back, and they climbed up and they put the crucifix back on the church. And then ISIS blew up the church the next day. So, I mean, it really is about striking terror. It is about, as Halla said, what the future Syria will be. What would it look like? What form this Islamic State will take. So it is actually destroying, but what's being destroyed really is the heritage of all of us.
It's the cultural values, it's historical values. It's about rewriting the history of that part of the world and actually feeding even some people, because people during the Syrian war become very vulnerable, and some of them become engaged in violence as a way of expressing their resistance, their kind of rejection of what they were projected to. The loss of their families make them engage in violence. And if you see in east of Syria, Raqqa, which is actually the Islamic State or wilaya there, which is actually controlled by the Islamic fundamentalists, they engage people with this kind of thinking that this is an Islamic State, we need to destroy churches, we need to oblige Christians to enter Islam. It's about women. Even women in some places are not allowed to sit on chairs. They have to be covered. I mean, there is a lot of human atrocities and heritage atrocities, but that is not about Syria as a country. It's about its heritage and what it stands for the whole international community.
And so what will it mean for Syrian identity in the future? I mean, already significant artefacts have been destroyed already. Let's say it halts immediately. Ultimately, Syrian identity has been changed, whatever happens.
I think it will take time for people to have kind of rehabilitation of the destruction that happened to human souls, to the places, to culture and heritage. But I think it is with the support of the international community, and I'm saying here the international communities have a big responsibility towards reserving and preserving the national heritage and culture of Syria. With the help of the international community, the Syrians would be able to retrieve this kind of diverse national heritage. But this will happen only if peace comes to Syria. If this crisis will continue for another 2 or 3 years, we will look for Afghanistan too or Iraq too in Syria.
In terms of protection, Richard, actually the idea of looted treasures has been dealt with by Hollywood. The film The Monuments Men, starring George Clooney, deals with this about Nazi looted treasure. And in fact, it was the author of the book that was made into the film made the point that with regard to Syria, the patrimony of Syria needs to be protected. He invokes the idea of drones being sent. There is actually a growing Western concern with the protection of what's going on there. Do you think this is more in the spotlight now?
I think it was in the spotlight during the looting of Iraq as well. I think the scale of what's happening at the moment is bringing it very, very sharply into focus. And I think that does matter. I think the Iraqi experience and perhaps helped Western audiences start to really think hard about this notion of a global heritage, and that this is a loss to us as well as to the people of these countries. And perhaps if we hadn't been through the tragedies of Iraq, we wouldn't see what's happening in Syria in quite the same way.
Emma, in terms of an international response, do you think there will be one? All the concern is about preventing civilian death toll from going higher. This is low on the set of priorities, isn't it? The international community want peace in Syria. The artefacts come second.
They do, and that's actually unfortunate because people separate them. Whilst humanitarian concerns, food, shelter, warmth are absolutely vital, it's only now that people are really starting to understand the relationship between cultural heritage and identity of a people, and that actually that also affects not only their sort of spiritual well-being, but there's new research being done in Australia, for example, that is proving that the destruction of cultural heritage in Iraq led to spikes in violence and a rise in death toll. There's similar research from Spain after the Civil War and similar research in Bosnia after the Civil War there. Actually, people's identity is very much tied up in these objects, and it's absolutely integral to a foundation for peace. So the international response does well. I mean, the money that the EU have just committed, for example, it's really important that it does also focus on how to protect it, because this very multicultural foundation is what Syria's peace will ultimately be founded on. if you destroy any strands of that, then it makes it that much harder to recapture it in the future.
Malu Halasa, you've co-curated exhibitions of Syria's art of resistance in 3 cities in Europe. What kind of work is being produced today by Syrians, and how is the conflict influencing what they're doing?
What's really interesting, I think, and the work that's the most accessible is probably the short films that are available across the internet. A lot has been made about the footage of actual fighting or atrocities that the activists have been putting up on the internet, but also artists, young filmmakers, musicians have been working together, and they have been making quite artistic short films about what life is like in Syria now. There's a very good collective called Masasit Mati who've done puppet plays called Top Goon, Diaries of a Little Dictator. The level of humor, the high production values. These films are quite interesting. Because in Syria, traditionally, the political postering would be all about the regime or pictures of al-Assad and his family. There's been a whole new emergence of artistic collectives that have been focusing on political postering, and their political posters are quite good. There's also a rise of a new comic book collective called Comic for Syria, and they have been making comic books and writing scripts about all sorts of things. But really what's interesting is that they focus on friendship between Sunni and Alawis. So what's happening with the art and culture of the uprising is that it's showing a very different face of Syrian identity. It is the identity that the Syrians have always had. But because of the destruction, the conflict, the violence, and the way that Syria is being portrayed in the media in a very particular way, you get a sense that this is a broken society when really it was very much a holistic society and people were very much in each other's lives. Syrian identity is very rich and inclusive.
Even before the uprising, Syria was very well known in the whole Middle East with its Syrian drama, which doesn't focus as much, on the political situation or scene as much as on the Syrian the mosaic fabric and the society and gender issues. And I think that is one of the cultural heritage of Syria, which I believe should be also preserved and become more creative and cutting edge after the hopefully post the war. I am optimistic as much. I think this is not the responsibility only of Syrians to preserve their identity and heritage as much as it is the international community to help Syrians.
But if the international community has not saved Syrians, I don't know if we can look to the international community to save Syrian cultural heritage. Among the activists that I've been working with is that they no longer think that they can rely on anybody else, and that Syrians themselves feel that they have to be responsible for their identity and make sure that they can express it loudly and clearly.
I think the international community is not saving Syrian, but the international community is divided in its approach or attitude or help to Syria because, it is divided between superpowers who have different interests in the region. However, I think the international community is responsible. Otherwise, we will have like what happened in Iraq, because the international community, which helped Syrian to be where they are now, to in their revolution, there was lots of support to the Syrian rebels. There was lots of support to Syrian people. I think they should help them in the future stage, not to abandon Syrians or abandon Syria. And that's why maybe we need international peacekeepers to help and preserve these cultural heritage sites inside Syria, to comply with Hague Convention 1954 of really keeping and saving these heritage cultures, these heritage cultural sites from the armed forces and from the regime shelling.
Obviously, the human suffering in Syria is heartbreaking, and for any of the superpowers to watch, it's heartbreaking for a whole range of reasons. Trying to bring actual peace on the ground is almost unimaginable to most of us now, but I think your point that it could be around the protection of heritage, that could be the place where there is common ground. There's nobody on the Security Council who doesn't believe in the value of heritage. All of these people are signatories to UNESCO agreements. That's a kind of neutral ground, a common ground. Maybe that could be where we could see blue helmets in Syria.
I would like to think that that would happen, but I don't think it is. I don't know. We'll see. But now I think that some of the art historians I've been talking to and some of the young art historians that I know that are Syrian, that because of the wide destruction of the cultural heritage of the country, now they think that the new art, the new films, the new writing that's going on now, that has to be seen as the country's cultural heritage.
Sadly, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but that's Malu Halasa, an editor and writer in London and author of an upcoming book called Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline. Also here in the studio, Richard Clay, a senior lecturer in history of art at the University of Birmingham, and Dr. Halla Diyab, a Syrian writer and filmmaker. On the line, we had Emma Cunliffe from the UK Committee of the Blue Shield. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.